Good morning and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to today's Facebook Live by Australian Indian Radio and Brisbane Indian Times. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's a beautiful day out there today. 18th of May and 13 degrees and mostly sunny. Well, let's get into the news for today and see what's happening. First of all, this is not very good news that, some of the Australians are doing it really tough, and this is what they're surviving on.
The charity organisation has surveyed nearly 1,700 Australians across the country who access their services, and what they found from this data was that on average Australia's most vulnerable are being left over with just $6 a day to survive off. It's after they pay for essential services like housing, food, groceries, utilities and fuel and other bills. They're just left over with just $6 a day to spend or to save. Now, the concern with this research is that it's also revealed that 52% of those are skipping meals altogether that are surveyed, and a further 75% are suffering from housing stress. We've already heard from one case study, a 55-year-old mother who says that over the last 9 months or so, she's lost nearly 40 kilos from the fact that she's had to spend most of her money to keep a roof over her children's heads. She's paying for their food, and she says that she's also taken the desperate measure of having to sell her own clothes to pay for her children's clothes. Lisa, this is just one of the many stories that we've heard over the last year or so of many desperate measures that Australians are going through to sort of beat this cost of living crisis. Now, the Salvation Army serves nearly 1.5 million meals across the year to Australians that access their homelessness service. But they say the most concerning part about this data is that people that used to volunteer for the Salvation Army are now among those who are accessing its service, and there's been an increase in those people that are accessing. Really is a telling tale of how difficult the crisis is getting for many Australians across the country, Lisa.
And of course, thank you very much for that report, as we know that things are getting very, very tough, really, really tough for many people. It is not easy these days to make really ends meet.
New South Wales paramedics and patient transport workers have started 24 hours of industrial action this morning and won't be taking patients home from hospital as part of a dispute over wages. Dialysis patients and those at the end-of-life care will be exempted from the action, and ambulances to hospital will run as normal. In some developing news, the ACT Director of Public Prosecution, Shane Drumgold, has been stood aside from the position while the Board of Inquiry into the handling of the Bruce Lehrmann case continues. The ACT Government Executive yesterday appointed Anthony Williamson SC, the Deputy DPP, to act in the position. Mr Drumgold has been under pressure at the Board of Inquiry, which is currently examining the case against Mr Lehrmann. Bruce Lehrmann has maintained his innocence, and there have been no findings against him after the trial was abandoned. Multiple children remain in hospital this morning following the collision of a truck and a school bus in Melbourne's west on Tuesday afternoon. The driver of the truck has been granted bail, charged with 4 counts of dangerous driving causing injury. He's expected to face court again in October. And the United Nations is warning global temperatures are set to break records in the next 5 years, with a 98% chance one will be the warmest ever recorded. The organisation's meteorological agency is predicting an El Niño weather event, and climate change will fuel the rise.
And climate change, once again, is the one to be blamed.
The housing affordability crisis and the rental affordability crisis is a complex problem, and it requires complex solutions. And government in its own right, whether it's the Commonwealth, state or local, cannot solve that crisis in their own right. It requires long-term solutions.
Why is that? Is it a funding issue? Why do you say that?
Partially, certainly a funding issue. If you think about the government, they contribute about $30 billion a year trying to solve some of their housing affordability issues. We believe that private capital, there is about $2.1 trillion private capital invested in the private residential market, and we believe that the private capital should be unleashed to help some of their housing and rental affordability issues.
Okay. Now, you argue that we need to move away from that traditional model of single owner occupier, single owner landlord to different types of funding models. What are the models that you think would work?
For sure, we looked at a number of models, but there was two key models that we believe are the models that we should pursue. One is shared equity model and one is institutional ownership model. And both those models, we believe, both in terms of scale, tenure and investment returns, are far more viable than just looking at build to rent and buy to rent, and also in looking at some of the demand solutions that have been trialled to date, such as stamp duty reform or first home grants. So we believe that those two models, the shared equity and the institutional investment, are better.
You're talking shared equity between government and private owner, or how would you?
No, we're looking at the shared equity where you're looking at where the private owners or the private investors, mum and dads and others, can actually contribute to the first home buyer, where the first home buyers are looking for some investment to buy their first home when they don't have the deposit. And we believe that if you unleash that 2.1 trillion, you can get actually mums and dads and other investors to contribute to that first home owner grant, rather than just government.
And just on the institutional investors, I mean, that's a much more common overseas, in many overseas jurisdictions. So we're seeing pushes now for example, more super funds to get involved in building housing. But also there are more innovative ideas such as real estate trusts, where you buy into part of a building, for example, rather than necessarily just buying your own apartment.
That's right. So if you look at the Real Estate Institute Trusts, institutional investors, we believe that if you actually have those out there, not only do you get long-term sustainable returns, but also you get better tenure for the renters. So you don't just have people, 71% of rental properties are from mums and dads, single investors. Real Estate Institute Trust put more investment in there, longer term, better return, but also sustainability for the renters.
Okay. What role does negative gearing have in all of this? Because, I mean, we have that army of mum and dad investors who have been aided in that by negative gearing. Should negative gearing continue?
Well, again, we want to look at some broader long-term sustainable solutions more on the supply side. Negative gearing, there's some work done by the RBA said that would actually have approximately about a 2% positive impact on prices, but not leading to a sustainable long-term solution. So we're not looking at tax reforms such as negative gearing. We're looking at other type of reforms that have been proven in some of the international markets.
So looking at the international markets and, replicating that model right here in Australia. Well, right now, there's a headache for our Prime Minister as Joe Biden pulls out of this Quad.
Smiles, or more likely grimaces, in the Oval Office.
We're having a wonderful time. Everything's going well.
As negotiations with Congress over how much debt the United States can rack up come down to the wire.
America pays its debts, pays its bills.
With the deadline looming, the president's decided time away from Washington, D.C. needs to be as brief as possible.
I'm cutting my trip short.
Joe Biden is heading to Japan for the G7 Leaders Summit this weekend and was then due to travel to Papua New Guinea en route to Australia, where he'd been invited to address federal parliament in Canberra before attending the Quad Leaders Summit at the Sydney Opera House.
The Quad Leaders meeting will not be going ahead in Sydney next week.
The American, Australian, Japanese and Indian leaders instead planning to sit down in Hiroshima. In an early morning phone call, Joe Biden promised Anthony Albanese he'll try to visit Australia later this year and offered him an invite to DC. India's Narendra Modi will still visit Sydney. Japan's Fumio Kishida will stay home. The president's security detail had been pre-positioned in Australia for some time. US Air Force planes flying in people, equipment and vehicles ahead of the Quad Summit. The dire warnings on the debt situation reverberating across the Pacific.
There are quite drastic consequences for the US economy, which will flow on to the global economy.
It is possible to get a deal by the end of the week. It's not that difficult to get to an agreement.
The Prime Minister says he understands why President Biden needs to rush back to Washington after the G7, but there's still little doubt that this is a significant disappointment for the Australian government. And at a time when the United States is trying to reassert itself in the Indo-Pacific, it's a setback for Joe Biden's strategic ambitions as well. Matthew Doran, ABC News, Canberra.
And what and good point is that Narendra Modi is still coming, as we know that the tickets are being distributed now for the public reception.
I'm standing on the outskirts of Bhutan's capital city, Thimphu, and this country is one of the most isolated nations on the planet. It's famous for measuring the happiness of its people, but it's in a pretty awkward geographical position. North of here is China, south of here is India, two countries that are major superpowers and two countries that have increasingly been having tensions over the years. Now, Bhutan relies heavily on India economically, and north of here, for decades, it has been trying to negotiate where its border lies with China. Bhutan's Prime Minister has told me that the two countries are now close to finalising where that border will be.
So we are drawing that line, and we are drawing in the most harmonious way. We are having a very peaceful dialogue, very friendly relation, friendly dialogue.
This news will be alarming for countries like India and Australia, which have come together much more in the last few years to tackle the growing presence of China in the Asia-Pacific region. The Australian Assistant Foreign Minister Tim Watts has been here in Bhutan. It's the first time an Australian minister that's currently sitting has visited this country, and it's to celebrate 20 years of diplomatic relations between the two countries. There are now large proportions of Bhutanese people travelling and migrating from here to Australia. But the minister has also said that the Australian government does not want any one country to have a dominant presence in this region.
We want to convey to Bhutan that, while Bhutan may be a smaller country in the region, all countries play a role in building the kind of region that we want to live in.
Now, going forward, Bhutan's government has called on Australia for more support, not just in terms of migration and education, but in the form of aid and building more industry here in Bhutan.
There you go, the report on Bhutan by Danita Das there. Well, right now, our going out report for today is looking at the students. Now, as we know, it's becoming very, very hard for many things in many areas. What about the HECS fees? What's happening with the students and the affordability?
How much is your debt?
For the whole course, I'd say around
the end of the course, it will be 32,000.
It'll be 36,000.
It's a bit over 40 grand right now, 47 or something.
I calculated it to be around 60,000.
University doesn't come cheap, and as inflation rises, so will student debt.
40,000,
60,000, 50k, a very big amount to be honest.
I don't think about it too much because it's quite a lot of money to worry about otherwise.
We will abolish fees at universities and colleges of advanced education.
Gone are the days when university education was free under Gough Whitlam. And if you were born after 1989, when the student loan system known as the Higher Education Contribution Scheme, or HECS, began, you'd never know the difference.
Did you know that university education used to be free?
No. That's crazy.
Wow.
Whitlam's fee-free education lasted for more than a decade. Until the late 1980s, when the Hawke government began reintroducing fees. Students weren't happy. But the purpose of HECS was to expand university places to more people. Economist Bruce Chapman helped design the system.
There was a very large unmet demand for university places, and to sort that problem out, the HECS system was able to generate the revenue which allowed the system to expand.
HECS later became known as the Higher Education Loan Program, or HELP.
Many more relatively poor people participate in universities than before, only repay this debt when and if they're earning sufficient income to make it easy.
The loans are interest-free and you don't have to repay until you earn a certain amount. At the moment, it's $48,000 a year. But the total amount now owed has ballooned to $74 billion. and it's taking people longer to pay back, from 7 years to 9.5 years. And it's not just young people. 37,000 older graduates in their 70s also owe the government money.
The reason that it takes slightly longer to repay now is that the fees have gone up. Some very high-earning young lawyers will repay their debt in 4 years. And some people, like nurses, for example, who are in and out of the labour force and working part-time, will take 30 years.
In Gippsland country Victoria, Isnaya Kennedy works as a teacher, having studied multiple courses.
A Bachelor of Arts with an honours in anthropology, a graduate diploma in psychology and Masters of Teaching.
After taking time to raise 3 kids, she's now 47 and owes debt from 1994.
Somewhere in here is my HECS debt remaining. Where is it? Oh no, that is it. That's ugly. 72,404. I think that it's just one of life's inevitabilities. I can't do anything about it except let it come out of my salary.
The debt is tied to the cost of living as a percentage, otherwise known as indexation. This percentage is applied to the amount of debt each year. Most years the rate has been low. Check out 1998. But this year, because of inflation, it'll be the second highest in more than 30 years. That means some people, like Geelong nurse Christina Sproul, will have their debts increase by more than what they're repaying.
It's just over $50,000. You're not really getting anywhere. You're paying it off, but then, you know, the government whacks all this money back on it. So it's sort of just standing still, and it is so deflating, like when you are paying for this debt that's not going anywhere. Sometimes you feel like you're going to carry that debt around on your shoulders until the day you die.
Women in their 20s make up the largest number of people in debt. They also owe the most amount of money.
The fact that loans are getting bigger and they're taking longer to pay off has particular implications for women who tend to drop out of the labour force to raise children. And what happens to these debts during that period of time is they increase because of indexation and no repayments are being made during that time.
We need uni and TAFE to be free.
The Greens, student groups and some economists want indexation scrapped, but the government has rejected the idea.
Freezing or abolishing educational loan indexation would have created immense relief for students who are going to see their debts rise by more than they're repaying this year.
The federal budget forecasts inflation to ease from next year, with wages to increase. Bruce Chapman argues that means the burden of student loans should even out over time.
Over the last 34 years, the real wage increase, that is wages above inflation, has been about 2.5%. Not recently, but that will come back. I'm quite confident that the wage situation for graduates when they're repaying their HECS will be such to more than compensate for the price increases that have been happening.
Until that happens, it won't feel that way for the millions of students and graduates still owing tens of thousands of dollars.
So there you are, tens of thousands. And as they mentioned that they couldn't help but look at the expression on this girl's face.
So what you're doing now would be completely free. How do you feel about that?
I feel ripped off a little bit. I feel like I'm born in the wrong generation.
Born in the wrong generation. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's all that we have time for today in this segment. And it's been wonderful having your company. But before we leave, we will take a quick look at the functions and events taking place right here in Brisbane. And So there you are, ladies and gentlemen, that's about all we have time for you today, and it's been wonderful having your company. As I mentioned before, it's always so good to see you all. Until tomorrow, it's goodbye from us.